Great. So thank you for joining, everyone. My name is Patricia Groover. I'm the Science Diplomacy Programs Coordinator at the National Science Policy Network, and my role is to manage the two science diplomacy programs that we have. So I'm a former science diplomat myself. I worked for the British and Quebec governments for about 7 years, and now I work on tech diplomacy for a number of different institutions, academic and think tanky. And then I also have 2 alumni of the program here. But first, I did want to talk a little bit about the program itself and, some basics that you might have questions about. Hopefully I can answer in this introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Abigail and Isabel. So we did rename the fellowship. If you formerly knew it as SciDEAL, Science Diplomacy Exchange and Learning, it is now called the Science Diplomacy Fellowship because we wanted to just be more clear about what it actually is. So it's a 6-month program that partners groups of early career scientists with science diplomacy organizations, including consulates and embassies. So we mainly work with foreign governments, and I would say that they are like-minded foreign governments that we work with. And we also work with nonprofit organizations or organizations that are working on the international aspects of science. So fellows will engage in a cross-cultural team-based project that will provide them with a professional learning opportunity in science diplomacy. And at the end of the 6 months, fellows will produce tangible outputs which contribute to the work of the host institution and increase collaboration opportunities for science diplomats or people working in science diplomacy in the field. So just a little bit more about it. So we do expect fellows to work about 10 to 15 hours per month on the project, and that can vary depending on, like, if you're at the end of the project and you're just trying to write a report, for example, if that's the kind of project you're working on, or if you're just thinking about the last cohort and some of the work was done over the summer, which will not be the case with this group, but that would have entailed less hours than normal. So I just got to admit somebody. So 10 to 15 hours a month. It is a virtual fellowship. You will not be expected to go to the geographic region where the consulate or embassy or organization is located. But there is an opportunity if the consulate or embassy or organization asks or would like the fellows to present somewhere. There is an opportunity to apply for professional development funds from NSPN to fund that travel. But that's not required. So you can stay where you are and still work for an organization that works on science diplomacy. And so now I'm going to hand it over to some of the alumni of the program who are going to give a little bit of an introduction about themselves and the projects that they worked on. Abigail or Isabel, it's up to you, whichever wants to go first.
I'll go ahead. So hi, everyone. My name's Abigail. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, but I'm actually located in Bethesda, Maryland, because part of my PhD is sponsored by the NIH. I joined NSPN a little less than a year ago, mostly with the intent to gain some skills in science diplomacy. So the Science Diplomacy Fellowship, as it's called now, was a great opportunity, especially for someone that was, kind of entering the space and wanting to get a general idea of the landscape. My project, I worked with the UK consulate based out of Chicago, their Science Innovation Network team, to review US STEM workforce development policy. And what we did is prepared a 17-page report, kind of providing a really broad overview of the entire STEM workforce development landscape. And then the goal of the report was to develop some recommendations for their team as to how they could work with the US to, develop workforce policies that would benefit both US and UK stakeholders. And that's kind of the general overview.
Yeah, and I'm Isabel. I'm a final year PhD candidate at the University of Queensland down in Australia. I've been in NSPN since I think late 2020 probably. Yeah, applied for this sort of as a, already working in like an international scientific space and wanted to get more of a feel of what science diplomacy was about. And specifically I applied mostly because I found the project really interesting. So what I got to work on was working with the Austrian embassy, runs a network for their scientists that live in diaspora, live in the United States, but are of Austrian origin. And so they try and make sure that they're talking to each other, that they're connected to their home country, that they can access resources and things and talk to each other and help each other move between countries or set things up and be resources and support each other. And they were kind of wondering what other networks are out there, how are networks working, supporting people. So a little bit sort of just like lay of the land type research. So we ended up doing a lot of interviews of these network managers and putting together a report and several papers about what networks are doing, what their goals are, and what sort of challenges they're facing. And then we also came up with policy recommendations and also made the case for why the US should maybe start thinking about investing in its own diaspora network for US scientists living abroad. Yeah, it was a great, we also got to present things at like AAAS and like Patricia mentioned, the embassy invited us to come and give talks once the research was sort of all wrapped up. And I didn't get to go, but we have people based in DC who were able to go there and give talks, and that was a great experience for them.
Thank you, Abigail and Isabel. And one of the other questions I think that a lot of people might have are what skill sets do you think are needed for the type of work that you both did?
I can go ahead. So what we worked on was a lot of bench research. I say bench, oh my God, desk research. So basically we were just using, the internet to track policy and explore the policy landscape. So kind of research, can you identify credible resources? And you probably should be able to at this point. And obviously you're working with a team of 3 to 4 individuals. So teamwork's really important. Communication is vital. And we did have a set of interviews, probably not as many as Isabel, so I'll let her kind of speak to that. But, how to conduct yourself in an interview, what is email etiquette, how to generate questions that are, appropriate for the person that you're interviewing. You need to do, background research on the individual you're interviewing to kind of get a best understanding of what types of information you can get from them and how to best extract that information from them. Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is communication and a lot of initiative. So, your supervisor isn't going to be working with you all the time. You need that initiative to keep yourself going, even when you don't have direct oversight. And so many of us, I guess, are graduate students and PhD students. So, research is very independent, and this is kind of a bit similar in that way. You really need the initiative to keep yourself focused and keep going.
Yeah, that's echoing, +1 for all of that. We had a kind of funky situation where our relationship with the embassy the initial point person who was managing the network got a new job, and then their replacement got a new job, and then so we had like multiple turnover with our embassy contact, and the person who was sort of the initially came up with the project. And so certainly I think it could have died if not for, the fact that we were meeting every week and discussing and like pushing the project forward. So that's a really good point about initiative, and in a lot of cases they'll kind of give you the idea, and if you want to, you can take it and run with it, and we certainly did, which was great. I think the other thing, and Abigail, you touched on this, is just like the willingness to learn new things and to be totally out of your depth in some of this stuff. A good chunk of our team had not done informational interviews, had not done qualitative methods or mixed methods research before. And so that was a whole new ballgame for a lot of us, and just being willing to learn. And we took, some trainings, but we also just kind of learned from the folks in our group who had experience with it, but just being open to new experiences. And I think that's generally rolling with the punches of things are not going to go as planned, often the way research does, and just being open to learning more, and being open to the possibilities and the skills you can build that way.
Thank you both. Those are both great answers. Another question that I know comes up from time to time is, what background do you think is needed for these projects? So some people come to these projects from like a policy background, and they want to get more involvement in science policy and science diplomacy, or they come from a scientific background or an engineering background. But do you think that there's a specific type of background that matters more than others, or how would you answer that question for somebody who's thinking about applying?
So I essentially had zero experience in science policy or science diplomacy, but I was really, really eager to learn. And I think like the thing that kind of carried me through is like, I'm a pretty quick learner, and I'm pretty capable conducting research. And so even though I didn't really understand how to read a policy piece, or especially how to write a policy piece, there was members of my team that did. And so just like trusting your team to also help you, gain those skills during the process. But in terms of background, I think, most of my team came from a science background, but some of us had more policy experience than others. So I think it can be very diverse. And to that point, I would say really use your teammates, and really kind of like utilize the expertise of your teammates, because the goal, as I understand, of the fellowship is to learn. You're given this opportunity to learn about science diplomacy. So I think that your background can really be anything, as long as you're eager and interested in the topic.
Yeah, 100%. I think the only thing I would add is, if you are coming from a policy background and you feel like you don't have enough, like, the teams are made better by a diversity of experience and a diversity of backgrounds. So don't let your background, don't feel like you don't fit. Like, you'll find a way to fit, and the teams, like exactly like Abigail was saying, the team will communicate and will be better for you bringing a different expertise to it. You'll learn from each other.
Thank you for those answers. I totally agree. I think, leveraging your team's strengths is really important. And also, there is no specific background. I know a ton of people who, are science diplomats, and they come from a policy or science background, or, they were climate change negotiators. So, there's all sorts of backgrounds that thrive in this field. So we do have a question. So are the fellowships only open to grad students, postdocs? No. Anyone can apply. We've had people who are, early career professionals or professionals looking to change their careers and get experience to see if this is maybe a direction they want to go in. And we've had master's students. I'm not sure if we've had an undergrad in the past, but we are open to it. We're not opposed to having undergrads apply. Are there any other questions from the rest of the participants?
Hi, I'm Tara. I have a question.
Sure.
Perhaps I missed it, but I was wondering, what are the anticipated start and end dates for this experience?
Yes, I should have mentioned that in the beginning. I'm sorry. So it would start in February. We're looking to do orientation around mid-February. So orientation is about 2 to 3 hours. You have a keynote speaker. This year is going to be the Chief Scientific Advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State, Dr. Allison Schweer. And then it's kind of, going over what the expectations are, some skills, like a very brief intro to science diplomacy 101. And then, it's 6 months. So you would end in August. And there is an opportunity, like, let's say, for example, I know Isabel's team continued to work on their project for another year after they were supposed to
I
finish?
think we were officially working for like a year and we just finished our report in like September of 2022, and we started in March of 2021. So we absolutely went overboard with ours. I feel like that's but they
did.
Yeah.
I mean, your team did publish something in, Frontiers in science. And so I think that was like a great showcasing the work that you can do in this program. But yeah, I mean, that's not required at all. Like, let's say your team wants to continue working on this project for another year or something, you can absolutely say, yeah, this is not for me, I'm done after 6 months. And that's totally fine. It's a mutual decision if you do want to continue working after the 6 months. But yeah, we only expect it for the 6 months. Yep. So the question about, do you apply to a specific project or the program? So we're having a 2-step application process this year. The first step is determining your eligibility. So you do have to be an NSPN member to do this program. The cost for grad students is about $20 a year and $10 a year for undergrads. After that, after you pass the eligibility screen, we will advertise the projects, and the fellows will have, or the applicants will have, I think 72 hours to read through the 4 projects and then pick which one, maybe like first choice, second choice, and even a third choice if they have more than one choice, and then just put why you would pick this specific project. And I can share a little bit more about the details of the specific projects because we're finalizing them currently. So one of the projects is with Euraxis North America. So they're funded by the European Commission, and they're basically the European diaspora network organizers. So they basically help to connect European scientists working in the US back to the EU. And they are hoping to get a group of about 4 to 6 fellows. So this would be the biggest group yet. and they would be doing a project similar to Isabel's project, but very specifically focused on certain countries. So one of the countries that they're thinking about is Turkey. I know they mentioned like Slovenia, Romania. These countries are not set in stone. I think Turkey's set in stone, but we're not sure. They're still determining the others for the mapping exercise for those diaspora networks in the US. And then the other project is the Netherlands Innovation Network. They're based in the US as well. And they're part of the Netherlands government, and they are interested in learning more about climate, greenhouse gas emission mitigation technologies in the US, and where are the opportunities for the Netherlands to partner with the United States on some of these emerging technologies. And then there is another project with an organization that works on capacity building in India. So that's not a government, but like I said, it's an organization that works on the international aspects of science. And then they also work with the Global Health Security Consortium, who is the only nonprofit organization at a secretariat that includes all the nations of the world, basically working on global health security. So that would be a really interesting and fun topic. And then the last one, we are still finalizing details, but it potentially would be with the Argentine government. And I think the next question is for Abigail and Isabel.
Has this fellowship shaped or changed my career goals? Probably. So for me, when I started, it was very exploratory. And like I said, I came in with, little to no experience. So yeah, I mean, basically what I learned that I did like was I like to review policy. I see policy as a way of, problem solving. And I really liked kind of the teamwork component of it. So I would probably like to pursue a policy type career. In terms of like the diplomacy aspect, the reason I chose the Science Diplomacy Fellowship as opposed to like we have a science policy opportunity or fellowship as well. I really have always been interested in international affairs and the way that two governments work together or the way that two governments collaborate, especially in science. How do scientific institutions collaborate, and how can we, make that collaboration? How can we develop policy that makes it more conducive to collaboration? So that's kind of where that interest came from. And I definitely do still have an interest in that. So I will probably be exploring careers in policy or diplomacy.
I think it definitely gave me some more context. So I think came into grad school with a slightly different perspective of I wanted to come in and get the PhD and get out and go back to, I was working in a government lab, which is still science, but it's sort of adjacent to the way that the government works and everything. And so kind of dipping my toes into actually hands-on science policy type stuff, sort of like Abigail was saying. And then the diplomacy aspect definitely opened my eyes to the range of careers for scientists at state. And so that's sort of, I don't know that it's necessarily changed the trajectory, because we're not done with the PhD yet, and we're not there yet, but it's certainly, I'm on USA Jobs looking at where I might end up after this, and state is now definitely on the list of departments that I check, type of a thing. So it's, I don't know that it's changed anything just yet, but it's definitely taught me that I can do it, and definitely opened my eyes to like the range of places where scientists can end up, which has been cool.
I'm glad you're both considering careers in diplomacy and policy after this. And Okay, so there is a question about recommendations or references are required. They are not required, recommendations or references. There in the application, you will see some questions about, how would you define science diplomacy? And like I said, once you get to the project matching portion, you would be asked, how does this, fit into how you see your career progressing, for example, or, why are you interested in this particular project? The next question, will fellows be compensated for their work or supported with a stipend? Yes. So this program is funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and it's a small stipend. It's only $500 for the 6 months, but after the 6 months, you will, if you fully complete the fellowship, you will receive the $500 at the end. Any other questions?
Sorry, Patricia, I was
No,
just
go
gonna
ahead.
add, I no one has asked this, but I also just want to say, like, so I think Patricia said the requirement is like 10 to 15 hours, and this is going to vary depending on, how far into your project you are. But I just wanted to say it's totally feasible on top of your PhD work. And, I think sometimes people are afraid to pursue opportunities outside their PhD, potentially because of their advisor doesn't support them, or maybe their program doesn't maybe offer the opportunities to do that, but it's totally feasible to do on time outside of your PhD. So I would definitely suggest, just, if that is something that you're thinking about, know that it's feasible.
It's also, I would add, a nice sanity check outside of your PhD. It's nice to, have, and certainly if you get something like really tangible, like a report or papers or presentations or all that kind of stuff, like, it's nice to, when your project is maybe mired in the nightmare that is a PhD project of things not working and whatnot, you kind of have like, oh, well, I can kind of refocus and this other thing is working very well, or, you have kind of something to balance maybe some of how things get rough when you're doing the PhD.
Yeah, thanks for those insights. Amy asked, is leveraging additional funding to support the work on this project acceptable or appropriate? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Like seeking additional funds?
Yes. In a prior career, I was a fundraiser. So if there is synergy between projects, would it be appropriate to pursue additional funding?
I would say probably not, just because just the way that it's set up and the fact that we work with foreign governments for, most of these projects. I would say that the funding that we have, while small, is all that we can offer at this time. And I know, you said something about fundraising, but I don't think that would be plausible. But I'm open, I'm open to hearing if you were a fellow and that's something that, you'd like to pursue. I think we could at least have a discussion, but I can't guarantee anything just because of the way it's set up with the host institutions.
I respect that. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions about like the particular projects that I mentioned? I'm sorry, I don't have more details about Argentina, but they're working on their proposal. Yonaida, I hope I didn't say that wrong.
No, you actually said that correctly.
Oh, great.
I just had a quick question, and I forgot it. I remembered. The question that I had was, generally, how does NSPN decide which governments they're going to work with, and is there like a call, or do you field from within NSPN on like what countries people would be interested in working with, or is it just availability? And can we determine that before I mean, here you are telling us this year, but perhaps next year, if it's more feasible for me, is there a way that I can know ahead of time what projects or partnerships are available that year?
Yeah, so because I used to work in this space, I tend to reach out with some of my former colleagues because I used to run an organization in Boston called the Science and Technology Diplomatic Circle, which was mainly European countries. So that's why we end up working with a lot of European countries, because that's where I have the most contacts. But we did have some questions and requests last year to have more projects from the global south. And so that's how we got, how I started to reach out to Latin American countries. And while I did have a lot of great exchanges with many Latin American countries, you know, some of these embassies are very under-resourced, and you'd think that they would want to take on a team, but when they are doing like 10 different sectors, they don't even have the capacity to help oversee a project like this. So unfortunately, that's where we ended up with that. And some other embassies have legal issues surrounding potentially working with you know, a group like ours that has stipend supported fellows. But you know, if there was a group that you know, wish that we would work with and that, you know, we haven't worked with yet, you know, I'm always open to looking into connecting with those countries or organizations. But like I said, a lot of these embassies or consulates are under-resourced, or they don't even have a science attaché or a science counselor. And so it is more difficult to partner with them, as they don't have a dedicated staff member that works on this particular topic. And if they do have a staff member working on science, they might also be working on 10 other things as well. So it might be one of the least of their priorities, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for explaining.
Yeah, sure. I hope that answered your question. Rohini asked, what is the group size for the other projects besides the Euraxis project? So the group size for the Netherlands would be 4 people. The capacity building in India and the Global Health Security Consortium would be 2 or 3 fellows. We're still working out those numbers. And then Argentina would be about 4. Any other thoughts, questions?
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
I just want to say, so Isabel, yours went on for over a year. So mine ran from, I guess, May to December. Is that 7 months or something? But actually I'm still working pretty closely with my group. And we think we're gonna probably publish some of our research somewhere. So also, even outside of, you know, your project, you could continue your relationship with your teammates, and, you know, leverage what you learned to pursue other opportunities.
That's great.
Yeah, and
I was just going to say to Abigail, when you submit your paper, let me know. Isabel, if you want to go ahead. Sorry
just
to cut you off.
echoing that same thing, like my team is still, and these are the other thing, I guess one of the other great benefits of this program, in terms of like, you're not just building skills and learning stuff, you're also meeting your teammates and like helping each other out. So you now build this group of people who, you know, we had several of our folks get accepted to become AAAS fellows, like while we were still all working together. So now we have people who can read when the rest of us finish and apply for that fellowship. You now have people who have gone through it, and you can talk to them and they can read your applications, and you do get like you grow your network. basically. I hate to be all networking and like networking and whatever. It feels so I don't know, structured and everything, but this is really a great way to like make a bunch of friends in this space, and people who are rooting for you and are going to help you out. And certainly our group is still, like Abigail said, you find these little offshoot projects that you're going to work on with each other, or that you know, we developed some things for NSPN that we're hoping to present at the conference in Houston. So like, we'll see how that goes. Like you make, the connections you make are honestly some of the, I would say, the most beneficial parts of this program.
Yeah, and that's great to hear, because I think one of the things that you learn in the field of science diplomacy is that you know, building relationships and building and networking and building connections is the most important part of your job. And so I think that that's great that, you know, that not only are you building connections among your peers, but these people go on to be potential great contacts to have in the future if you're applying for fellowships, or, you know, you're looking for information on applying to a US government job, for example. Are there any other questions? Oh, okay. So the cost of applying to the fellowship. So if you're not an NSPN member currently, I think it's $10 for undergrads for the entire year. And you don't only get access to this program, but it's also all of our other programs and our committees that people run, like Abigail, for instance, and Isabel runs a committee as well. So they, you know, you can get involved in different parts of the organization, whether it's advocacy, science communication, science policy, and then $20 a year for graduate students. And I'm not sure how much it is for affiliated members, which are, you know, professionals. I should know this, but I don't. Let me see.
It's 40.
I'll just look at oh, it's 40. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I should have known that. Yeah. So we also have a program called Science Policy Scholars in Residence, where you do a 6-week boot camp working on a policy memo, and then you basically do like an internship / residency at an organization that we partner with, you know, hopefully around the topic of your policy memo, or at least tangentially related. But yeah, that's another great program that we have as well. And then, as Isabel mentioned, we have an annual symposium, and this year it's in Houston. So that's another opportunity that we have. And one thing I will mention is, you know, some of these organizations aren't all based on the East Coast. So 3 of them are based on the East Coast, but 1 of them is based on the West Coast. So, you know, it doesn't matter where in the US you're located, or where in the world, as long as you're a US citizen, since Isabel is based in Australia. But yeah, you know, if you're based on the West Coast and you're like, well, you know, this organization is based on the East Coast, that doesn't matter. You know, they look for times that work for everybody, to do these Zoom check-ins or whatever. And, you know, that's not a problem. And I think the other thing I'll mention is when we look at teams, we try to get geographic distribution across the country for the teams, so that, you know, it's representative of the makeup of the US and not just an East Coast, West Coast thing.
I'd add to that, you get a little bit of a taste of the diplomacy aspect of it, where, you know, sometimes your embassy contact will be in Europe and suddenly you're organizing across multiple time zones and all that type of stuff, and you might need to meet at a really funky hour, but like it'll give you a sense of whether that's something you want to do.
Yeah, the team that the institution that works with India, they actually, one of their team members is on the East Coast of Australia. So they said that the team would have to be flexible in their working hours, which would be East Coast evening times to connect with the person in Sydney. And they would also be in India as well, but they switch on and off between Australia and India. But one of the questions, if you do end up in the science diplomacy field, you get asked is, how do you work across time zones? And I think the pandemic kind of helped us all learn how to do that. But, you know, I think this is definitely if you haven't done that, this is a good way to get that experience. Any other questions? I will add that, you know, in the past we have done career workshops where we have speakers that have had, you know, various career paths into science diplomacy come and talk to the fellows. The Science Diplomacy Committee actually does a lot of that work as well. So we try to collaborate where possible. And, you know, we also have, we also did a negotiation skills workshop that was open to the fellows last year to gain those skills. And that was with Abigail, did you do that? It was with like a UN negotiator.
No,
Okay.
I don't remember.
Yeah, no, it was like in the summer. It was in August, but it was somebody that led like UN climate change negotiations. So it was a pretty high level expert, which was great. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, if there's no other questions, I don't know, Abigail or Isabel, if you have anything else that you'd like to mention before we wrap up, unless there's any last minute questions. And I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if anyone has any follow-up, you can email me here. Yep, and that's.
I'd also be happy to share my email if anyone wants to learn more about experiences. That's okay, Patricia?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I'll drop
Well,
mine in the
thank you
chat
all.
as well.
Thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Isabel and Abigail, for sharing your experiences. And I look forward to seeing, you know, where your careers take you.
Nice to see everyone and good luck.
All right,
Best of
have a
luck,
wonderful
everybody.
evening, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Really appreciate
Bye.
everyone taking the time to share. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. Good evening.